Okay, I think we're about to start this kind of very small session, which is good because it's a bit about testing the waters on whether there's interest in this topic. If you want to look at the slides while I'm talking, they're already on ifric.gitlab.io Drupal-UI text. And as you might notice by now, we're supposed to use the slide deck with the sponsor slides. So you're going to have seen them by now already. Thanks to all the sponsors. Just a few words about me. I'm IFRIC in the issue queue and I should speak into the microphone. I'm IFRIC in the issue queue and on Twitter. I'm not a developer by education. I'm a biologist. I'm a scientific editor. I'm a political activist, which means I've learned a lot about the use of words and how to make words so that people understand what I want them to understand. I'm a Drupal site builder, so I build lots of sites for small NGOs, grassroots organizations. I've been part of the documentation group and the UX team, and I've basically moved from documenting things that were difficult to do to trying to fix things. And I've become more and more interested now actually also in the words that are on a Drupal site. So just a short introduction, what are actually these user interface texts? And I use the plural here even so that's not grammatically correct in English, because I think we have very different types of text on a Drupal site. So for the developer, it's quite often just little bits of words that you have in your code, like this is from the Field UI module where you have save manage fields and manage fields. That's the kind of text that the users will later see. But in the rest of the codes, that's actually just a very small bit. And quite often the functionality of the code, the writing tests, seem to be the much more important task than the question on whether it should be save and manage fields or something slightly different. So that's a little bit of UI text that the developer tends to see. For the user of the website, the visitor of the website later, there's some text that actually come directly from Drupal, like the read more or login or register to post comments, or the special characters are allowed for the username. They're kind of bits of text that describe Drupal functionality. Typically, that's a bit of text that's getting forgotten when the design is made. It's also the bits of text that are out of reach of the site builders quite often. If you're trying to change that text, you actually have to kind of hack core or do something else you don't really want to do with your site. And then we have the site builders, the front-end developers, the translators, the administrators, the evaluators who look on whether they want to use Drupal or not. And they see much more. They see all our kind of navigation things. They see different actions, different buttons, different tables, explanations on each admin page. And I've just counted them for a default Drupal installation with no extra modules in core or contrib. That's already 200 pages. So that's 200 pages that are full of text. And this text doesn't come out of thin air. That is the UI text that all of us who contribute to Drupal actually writing. So if you think UI text is a kind of small thing, no, it's a whole book. And that's getting more with every single contrib module. So yeah, as I said, that's 200 pages. Just if you print that out, you don't want to. So for me, the UI texts are the words that developers actually speak to the users. It might be not so much for the developer, but that's what the users actually see. Somebody who installs a Drupal site doesn't actually see the functionality yet. They mainly see words. They see a few visual elements, like kind of drag and drop things or drop-down buttons. But first of all and foremost, that's just words. So on that basis, we can actually say UI texts are important, which is why we have UI text standards, except we don't. Drupal doesn't have UI text standards. If you look on Drupal.org, you'll find something like the content style guide. It gives you information about which terms to use or what words not, or the kind of style that you should write a module with a capital letter, that you shouldn't say please or shouldn't use he and she, but they, those kind of things. But that's actually the style guide for Drupal.org. That's not for Drupal as the software. So you can look a bit further. You find actually somewhere under the user interface standards, no, user interface, somewhere in between buttons and drop buttons, you also find a little bit about user interface or interface text. Again, that's much more about the style of the words that you should use. It has some little information about that the delete button should always be called delete, and cancel should always be called cancel. But that's quite a short page that gives, again, more the style, the tone of voice. And then we have actually something that is described as a help text standard that describes on how you should write the help text for your module, and also a bit about the description of the module. That's hidden away somewhere under documenting your project. And if you don't stick to that, don't bother, because even if you make a patch for somebody else's module, it usually just gets ignored or forgotten, or somebody says, yeah, but I don't like the passive tone of voice, so I do it anyway. So, and this page, even though that's longer, has much more help about how somebody who's writing documentation gets the right syntax into the PHP module without breaking it. None of them is actually standards that we're trying to enforce, with the one exception that there should be a link to the documentation on Drupal.org, because there's a test for that. So if you look a bit further, you actually find something like this. All summaries must be less than 80 characters, start with a capital letter, and end with a period. They must provide a brief description of what this element does. I suppose you know where that's coming from? Any guesses? Exactly. This is not for UI text. This is the Drupal API documentation standard. This is what we say about how you write a comment in the code that other developers see. It's actually part of a much, much longer documentation about how you write comments in code. And if you don't do that, you actually get nitpick reviews for your patches. They say, nah, it's missing the dot at the end, which is fine. There's a coding standard, you put the dot in, full stop. So this is actually a standard we have for text. When you look on the side, you think, oh, actually, maybe somebody has used this standard to describe our module descriptions. They're usually short, start with a capital, end with a dot. Unfortunately, not all of them do. Some of them are so long that you start side scrolling on the default Drupal site. Some of them have information about how to uninstall your module, or the general concept of blocks, or that's all on the extent page. And I doubt that anybody is going to scroll sideways to read how you should uninstall the Solar Search default module. Not at least on that page. So seeing that we actually have coding standards, we could actually make a similar standard, quite straightforward, to say all module descriptions must be less than 80 characters, start with a verb in the capital letter, end with a period, and together with the module name, they must form a sentence that describes what the module does, or what it allows the user to do. To me, that would be a standard that we could actually write down and use. And this is then actually for a text that not only your co-developers see, this is a text that lots and lots of users will be seeing when they install a new module, when they install a new site. I can't remember the numbers again that were listed in the keynote tomorrow, but if you apply that, that will be several thousands of people reading that without having to scroll. So who are we actually talking to when it comes to these UI texts? Other developers, obviously. They're not only reading your code, they also might look at the UI of your module. Site builders, themers, front-end developers, translators. That's both translators for config and UI text, as well as translators for user-generated content. Technical support staff, like those people that take over the sites and the project that somebody else have built, and they have to figure out what was going on there, what they need to maintain. Content creators, and of course the visitors of the website themselves. And they all accept something from these texts. But luckily, not all of them are looking at the same texts. Not all of them need to see or read the same things. So I'll just go through the kind of areas that I've identified so far. So coming back to the module description, that's something that actually site builders, developers, and technical support staff see. Either when they want to enable a module on the site, or when they run a composer update to figure out, which modules need updating. It's useful to know which modules actually might be really crucial, and you need to double check. So they are the ones that are reading these kind of module descriptions. Your designers, your website visitors don't. And there's some help text for how to use some functionality on the Drupal site. That's, for example, something like add a new comment, which, by the way, you can't change the word comment here, even if your comment is called something different. It's information about what kind of image files can you upload, which size. This is text that the visitors of your site or your project see, content creators and translators work with. For some reason, I've regularly run into an issue that I've been asked whether I can change that text under the image file to something that is in one line instead of 3, or that sounds a bit nicer. But this is beyond my reach as a site builder. So this is why I think these texts we have to pay lots of attention to, because that's something that people that work with the site regularly come across time and again. And there is no way for the site builder quite often to actually interact with them. Some of them are hard-coded. And if we ever do A/B testing of text, then this, for example, would be my kind of prime candidates. I'm seeing, does it make a difference? There's lots of navigation elements, which are also UI text. There's our whole admin menu. There's also the question on how does a page title and a tab title relate to? Because, for example, on the permissions page, both the tab and the page title are called permission. On other pages, the page title seems to stay the same, only the tabs are different. There isn't any clear rule for that. In general, actually, tab titles are in real context, so we could handle them more differently. And there's all these drop-down menus, drop-down lists with operations that give you an idea where you're going or what you can do with things. They are used by lots of people. They are used by the site builders, the front-end developers, the administrators, content creators, translators, evaluators who look at the Drupal site for the first time. They all need to use these navigation elements. And we don't have a clear understanding how they should be best done. There's performing tasks. That's all the kind of buttons. There we have some more rules for that to make sure that delete always stays delete and is red and underlined. That cancel is always called cancel, except from we currently have an open issue about renaming this cancel account and cancel. So the idea was to maybe just call cancel abort here, because then it doesn't conflict with cancel account. And that suddenly gets in the kind of bike shedding conversation, preferably without any UX input or so. So that's kind of things where having standards would be really useful, because it makes it very consistent, again, for a large number of users. We've got error messages and confirmation messages. There we actually have visual elements, but also not clear rules on what's the best way of making them useful. Should they maybe have more words in that you can Google if things go wrong? Or should they be short? Should they be long? Should they have links? and pretty much everybody comes across them. We've got the help pages, which are all hidden away by the help module on the help section of the site, for which we actually have an idea on what should go in them and the structure they should have. They're very much only for each module, and quite often there's no connection between when you're using the module, you don't actually find those help pages. They are, however, the ones that most of the work goes in when they're properly reviewed. Unfortunately, nothing actually prompts a developer to write any of this. If you run a test, only the sentence, see the online documentation for this module, there's a test for that. For the rest, if you only write an about section with that sentence, you're fine. It's just not useful for the users. Help text is on the admin pages, and I think that's the area where we could do the biggest win in actually thinking about what to do with them. This is the manage display description that is on top of the page that you always have to scroll past when you want to rearrange which fields to show. This is the same text that was in Drupal 7. Even so, there's now much more things you can actually do with this display modes. You could, for example, link to the views module if it's enabled to say this is where you can use them. You could link more prominently to the fact that you can actually make more different display modes. We could offer something like best practices here on what's a good way of naming these different things. Because at least I still end up with a site where I thought, why the hell did I name them like this or that? And then I do a different project and still trying to figure out the best practice for Drupal 8 with that. And while I was sitting in the keynote this morning, I also thought this would be the place, for example, to give you the drush command. And quite a lot of modules you can use either through the GUI or drush on the command line. But they are very much disconnected. If you want to find out how to use that, you have to go to the command line or go to drush commands to figure out that there is one for what you want to do. We could also say this is a good place for actually saying, if you're using the command line, this is the command you're looking for. For quite a few sites, that would also be a performance improvement. Because, for example, running migrations or so, better off doing that on the command line than in the GUI. So I think this is where we could actually sit down and see what would be useful here. Not so much on what does the developer think would be useful for a vague group of users. Who do we think are reading these texts, and what is the help we could actually offer them there? To me, that's mainly site builders, themers, front-end developers, and administrators who go to these pages. So I would be happy to sit down with people and see what can we offer there. And then there's a few more very specific explanations for fields. This is if you manage a link field in the form, and you see that basically the text is twice the same. I think the text is too long. Maybe seeing what would be a good practice there for this kind of text that we as site builders look up every time. They also clutter up our forms. What's the balance between not cluttering up forms and giving useful information? And then we still have some hard-coded text. If the question was what's annoying me, hard-coded text in core. There's an issue for changing this submitted by username at a date in a specific format. If anybody wants to work on this during this sprint, I've got the issue numbers on the last slide. So basically, different UI texts have very different purposes and have different audiences. And I think we need to look at that. We need to look at who's using navigation, who's seeing these error messages, who needs the help that comes on a field, who doesn't. Who are you talking to with each text, and trying to balance our texts on that level. And if you're wondering now why all of this, and that's not so much because are like standards and I want to keep everything the same. I mean, our coding standard says a line of code is 80 characters long because the old IBM punch cards had 80 characters. We can move beyond that. So it's not for sticking in some old frame of mind. For me, if we can develop UI text standards, we can actually sit down together and discuss them once and take a decision then, and then take it and actually work from there. So, yeah. So we can discuss them once instead of bike shedding in every single issue. We can actually get patches RTBC'd faster. And actually, if we get text changes in faster, it also means that we only have to translate them not so often. Because now we have still some UI text changes that were nearly ready when Drupal 8 came out, but they got bike-shedded to hell, which means all of this text has been translated for the last several years. If we change them now, they all need to be translated again. If you release your module with a text and somebody comes and says, actually, if we rephrase this, then it would be easier to read, to understand. Any translator who has translated that does need to do the work again. Having UI text standards could also help us getting different types of people to contribute. There's lots of people who know actually how to write for users. Most of them end up writing books. So we got stuck in there's the books written, which is why we can't change UI text. If we can, those people who know how to write, who know how to address users, if we can get them to actually contribute to the code and tell them, we need help here, we need help that, we would have a different type of contribution that is much more connected to the code instead of adding a level of, here's my book to explain you how to use Drupal. And of course, it would provide some consistency to users. If we make sure that everybody calls modules modules, then users don't get lost. I don't know if any of you have installed Web4 module, which has lots of amazing functionality, but it has a list of add-ons. It has a list of plugins and add-ons, and I got completely confused until I realized it has a list of useful modules you can use with your Web4 module. So providing some consistency to users can be helpful, even so if you might prefer another word, even so if you might think, actually 92 characters would be a much better line of code than 80. Once you have a standard, it's much easier to simply stick on using that one, I would think. So, which leads me to the question, how do we get there? And this is why I think it's a bit testing the waters. But basically 2 questions. Can we just sit down and write them and say, here they are, comment on this for a few months, and if people agree, then we make them standards? Do we need to spend a long time discussing whether we even want to have them? And if we want to have UI text standards, how do we involve others to contribute and to follow them? And that's my 2 main questions. Thanks. I don't know whether there's any other questions from you or any answers to this. Yeah. Since I'm a technical writer, I would say yes, I can just sit down and actually have a go at them and see whether other people identify other areas, think there's different users. But I'm not sure what happens once they are written, how we get people to actually say, yes, this is useful or not. Or if nobody comments, can I just say, okay, nobody said this is bad, this is now a standard. I put it on Drupal.org. I have enough permissions to put it in the right place, and then you have to follow it. So I think it needs some more involvement to actually take this up, which I think probably only works if we can convince people that UI text standards are a useful thing to have, which is the second problem. Core maintainers, product managers, as a kind of leading example, because if you'd say, I only accept a patch or I only commit something if it follows at least some of the standards, that would be a way. We have some modules now gone in core that, for example, don't only have the about section, the help text, nothing else. But yeah, mainly also people that accept patches, because if I can say, here's a patch to your UI, your texts, I'm following this standard, and they would say, okay, that's great. You might not know PHP, but you know about writing. Then that would work. But I think mainly convincing people that are involved in core development, because that is something that needs to be where you can lead by example. Where you can say core is doing these texts like that. So that would, to me, would be a good starting point. Mm-hmm. As I said, the product managers, who's sitting, one of them is sitting there. The core maintainers that you've, there's another one. The leads of initiatives, one of them. Okay, the people involved in the current initiatives, they actually listed in the maintainers text in the Drupal core, and somewhere on Drupal.org on the website. So they're actually people with kind of names and faces, and some of them are here. There's another. Oh, yeah. I think for different texts, different roles. Certainly people who can write. Developers, certainly, because you also always need to check whether, when you've rewritten a text, whether it actually still says what the module does. Sometimes the texts are kind of a bit unclear, so if you rewrite them, you might actually mess up the functionality. Sometimes you miss a functionality because it's not documented. So getting the feedback from somebody who knows actually what the module does is always a very important step, I find. For some things, you think it's very easy to rewrite a module description, for example, until you realize that actually the module doesn't do that. It just hadn't been clear to you. So yes, we always need the feedback from the people who actually understand what the module does. And I would actually also be interested in doing testing about some of the more kind of website visitor-facing texts, like error messages. I suppose we're all cursing error messages from other systems where you don't know which one the relevant words is to look for, or you don't know whether you made an error or there was a bug. So improving error messages, I think, would also be great, because usually the people that encounter error messages are the people who are not completely understanding the ins and outs. So I think there's different people to talk to for different parts of these texts. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm also happy to. Oh yeah. I think for a few things it could, more for the kind of formal things. I don't quite know how this coding standards are implemented in the different things like PHP Storm, for example. I would like to start also with something that is kind of simple. If I can say a module description starts with a verb and makes a sentence with the module name at the beginning and then the sentence. That would be something that's definitely shorter than the coding standard we have for the first line of a doc block in your code. So I would start them short and have the minimum in there. And if they are getting used and we find that there's kind of ambivalence, we could extend them. But yes, I think they need to be very short and concise because yes, otherwise people won't go through a long list like the Drupal.org interface text that goes on for pages to say whether you should use please or not. I haven't read that through that. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, this first issue is actually an issue to make both the author and the creation date a normal field that you can use just as any other field in the manage display of an entity. But again, that already comes with some baked-in text already. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yeah, actually, I was wondering about asking what the kind of words are that people do translate when they translate English to English. Which kind of phrases lots of site builders actually change in that way. Whether there is a kind of pain points that lots of us translate. If people are looking confused, you can actually, if you turn on English, or if you have English as a language, as a little tick box, we can say you can translate English to English, and thereby you can translate some of the interface texts or replace them with another English words. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, collecting examples of that could also be a good source to see where we might want to change the kind of hard-coded texts. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. that's a good idea. I would also like to put in, for example, saying this is probably the target audience for this bit of text. So you have some guidance of for whom you're writing. I'd also would like to, because now when you make issues for Drupal, you can make them by module or by larger area. If you make any issue about UI texts, you can either mark that as documentation, which it's not really, or you can add UI text as a tag. But there's no general way of saying for working on actual words like this. And I also think maybe we could also encourage people that develop modules to say, I want help on the wording of this before we release a new version of the module. A kind of more active approach of saying, these are two different tasks, this is two different types of expertise. And therefore, instead of a module developer making a module and then getting bug reports and issues and maybe patches, also asking module developers to actually actively ask for help, both for UX issues as well as for UI texts or design issues sometimes. Because we have this wide expertise within the Drupal community, and we should make more use of that. Anyway, I'm happy to discuss that further over a beer tonight or in the sprint room. Which sprint room are the UX issues in? Okay. If you look for Christina to thank her for the Unami work, you probably find me in that room as well. Thank you.